This is part 2 of the lecture notes for chapter 23. We are starting with slide 25, and our topic is the lycophytes. We covered the bryophytes, remember. The bryophytes are the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, and they are non-vascular. So now we are covering the lycophytes and the pteridophytes, which are vascular plants. Vascular plants are also called or also known as tracheophytes. And they can grow a whole lot taller than the non-vascular plants because they have roots and vascular tissue and conducting tissue. So the two types of vascular tissue that conduct materials throughout the plant are xylem and phloem. The xylem conducts water and minerals up from the roots of the plant throughout the rest of the plant, all the way to the top, all the way to the tip of every branch, if it's a tree. And lignin strengthens the cell walls of the conducting cells in xylem tissue. So xylem is conducting water and minerals up from the roots. Phloem is conducting sucrose and other organic compounds throughout the plant, starting with the leaves, because sucrose is food for the plant. So when the plant makes its own food in the leaves through photosynthesis, it's going to conduct that food all the way throughout the plant, even down to the roots. In fact, a lot of times the food is stored in the roots as starch. So xylem conducts water and minerals up, and phloem conducts food down. And that's how I remember them. So those are the two types of vascular conducting tissue found in vascular plants. And then just on this page, the lycophytes and all the other vascular plants have a dominant sporophyte generation. So the lycophytes and the pteridophytes are seedless vascular plants. This is a fossil of Cooksonia, which is a lycophyte. And the lycophytes, the roots have evolved as lower extensions of the stem. So we didn't have true roots in the bryophytes, but we do in the lycophytes. The leaves are called microphyls because they're small and they only have one strand of vascular tissue. So like one little vein that runs down the middle of each little tiny leaf. They also have structures called strobili, which are cone-shaped, and they produce spores. So they're like little miniature cones. Some lycophytes have spores that grow into one type of gamete, and the others produce, so that means they're homosporous, and the others produce two types of spores, and that means they're heterosporous. Microspores become male gametes, and megaspores become female gametes. And I always remember this because the male gametophytes produce sperm, which are small, and the female gametophytes produce eggs, which are large compared to the sperm. So that's how I remember microspores and megaspores. The three main groups of lycophytes are the ground pines or club mosses, and spike mosses and quillworts. So here is a picture of a lycophyte, and here you can see an illustration that shows you the strobili, which are cone-shaped, but they're small. The next group of plants are the pteridophytes. They are also seedless vascular plants, like the lycophytes. They include ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns. This time, instead of microphyls or small leaves with one strand of vascular tissue, they have megaphylls, which are broad leaves that have several strands of vascular tissue. So this is a picture of a microphyll like you would see in the lycophytes, and a megaphyll like you would see in the pteridophytes. Horsetails consist of one genus, Equisetum, and they are found in wet, marshy environments. Many horsetails have strobili, like the lycophytes, and the stems are tough and rigid because they have silica or glass deposits in their cell walls. So this is what a horsetail looks like. And whisk ferns resemble brooms. And then we have ferns. So if you remember for the bryophytes, we had 3 examples: mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. But the plant that we focused on the most were the mosses. So in the pteridophytes, our primary example is going to be the fern. And you've probably seen ferns growing in hanging baskets on people's porches, and you probably have seen them if you've been walking in the woods. They are most abundant in warm, moist tropical regions, but we have them here as well in North Carolina. They have large, conspicuous, that means easy to see, megaphylls that are called fronds that are divided into leaflets. So each frond is technically a leaf composed of many smaller leaflets. On the back of the fronds are these clusters of sporangia called sori, and they're brown, and they will release spores when it's time, and the spores are wind blown. Of course, the ferns have a dominant sporophyte generation, just like all of the lycophytes and all of the vascular plants. Here's some different pictures that we have of ferns. We have a leatherleaf fern, a hart's tongue fern, and here we have a tree fern. It looks almost like a palm tree, similar. The life cycle of the fern plant. First, I wanted to point out, because I have a personal interest in edible and medicinal plants that we can find around us and use in cooking and medicine, particularly though I'm more interested in the edible plants that you can use in cooking. So if you can ever catch the time of year when the fiddleheads, which are the immature fern fronds, when the fiddleheads are growing, those are really, really good to as far as to cook. They're just another type of green. So if you like greens, you can stir fry them or whatever. There are different recipes online. But let's go back and talk about the life cycle, the fern life cycle. First of all, when you see the fern plant, the fern plant that you recognize is the sporophyte generation. And on the underside of those fern fronds, you have these little brown dots called sori, and they contain the spores. So when they release the spores, which were produced by meiosis, so the spores are haploid, when they release the spores will germinate, and they will form into this little heart-shaped leaf called the prothallus. And we're looking at the underside of the leaf because you will see, unlike the moss where like for each moss gametophyte, it was either a male or a female. But for the fern, you will have female archegonia and male antheridia on the same gametophyte, on that little heart-shaped leaf. So the gametophyte structure is haploid, and the archegonium produce the egg, the antheridia produce the sperm, and the sperm will swim to the egg and fertilize it. Once it is fertilized, it will become a zygote, which is diploid, and that zygote will grow up out of that gametophyte into the sporophyte, which is the dominant generation of the fern. And it will grow even more into a fiddlehead and then into the fern fronds. There are many, many uses of ferns, medicinal uses and as ornamental plants. And now we're going to move on to the seed plants, which include the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So seed plants are vascular plants that use seeds instead of spores. The seeds contain the sporophyte embryo and also stored food within a protective seed coat. So a seed really contains three parts: the embryo, the food, and the seed coat. Seed plants are heterosporous, which means they have both microspores and megaspores, both the male and female gametophytes. And again, the microspores become male gametophytes or pollen grains, and then the megaspores become the female gametophytes, which is technically the embryo sac, which contains the egg or eggs, ova. They're called ova. Now, we know fertilization is when the sperm meets the egg, but pollination is when either the wind carries the pollen or an animal pollinator, like a bee, carries the pollen to the female gametophyte, and then the pollen grain will grow a pollen tube, which will carry the sperm to the ova or egg, to the ovum. All right, gymnosperms are mostly cone-bearing seed plants, and angiosperms are the flowering plants. So flowering plants produce a flower and a fruit, and the fruit is the ripened ovary of the plant. Okay, starting with the gymnosperms, the seeds of gymnosperms are not enclosed by a fruit, so gymnosperm literally means naked seed. Gymno means naked, sperm means seed. The groups of gymnosperms are conifers, which are like, pine trees, cycads, ginkgos, and netophytes. Conifers produce cones, and they have needles. Of course, the sporophyte generation is dominant because it's dominant in all the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Pollen grains are dispersed by the wind, and we're all suffering from all of that pollen right now, this time of year, particularly, I guess, pine pollen. The dispersal stage is the seed, and conifers are monoecious. So this is a new term, and it means that there are both pollen and seed cones on a single plant. So for example, and you can see them really, really good this time of year. You can see on the pine trees, we have in North Carolina, we have the loblolly pine, which is our state tree. And you can see on the tips of the lower branches, the male cones. The male cones, a lot of people don't even realize that pine trees have male and female cones. And the female cones are the ones that we recognize as pine cones. They're a lot larger, and they have those woody scales, and they fall on the ground, and you have to pick them up and, do something with them when you're cleaning up your yard, if you have pine trees in your yard. But the male cones are yellow, and they produce the pollen, and they're going to be on the lower, this time of year, you'll see them. They're on the lower branches of those pine trees. And so then you can see the pine life cycle. And the only thing I want to mention, well, I'm just going to wait and focus more on the life cycle of the angiosperm. You can go back and look at the pine life cycle if you want to, but I'll probably only ask you about the angiosperm life cycle. So conifers are very useful. They can be used in medicine. Their needles and bark are rich sources of vitamins, and they can be used to create teas that ease the symptoms of a cold or a cough. Cycads have cones that can be more than 1 meter long, and they are dioecious rather than monoecious. Their pollen cones are on one plant, and their seed cones are on a separate plant. And they're pollinated by insects rather than wind. This is a picture of an African cycad, and you can see the large cone. So ginkgos only have one surviving species, Ginkgo biloba. They are dioecious, like the cycads. They're native to China, and ginkgo seeds are considered a delicacy in Asia. Their extracts, the ginkgo extracts, have been used to improve circulation. This is a picture of the ginkgo biloba where you can see the seed and the leaves of the ginkgo. Netophytes, there are a couple of interesting examples of netophytes. One is called the ephedra plant, and it produces ephedrine, which is a medicine that I would say around 20 years ago, there was a diet pill that came out. I can't even think of the name of it right now. I actually took it, and it worked, but it had ephedrine in it. And you just felt like you were racing. I mean, you inside, you know, it was like being on speed, honestly. And it was causing heart problems, so they banned it. But anyway, that plant produces the chemical ephedrine, and which is very similar to caffeine, but can cause heart problems. And then welwitschia is found in Africa, and it only has 2 leaves. I'll show you a picture. This is ephedra. This is what ephedra looks like. And this is a picture of welwitschia. Welwitschia can live like hundreds of years. And it only has 2 strap-like leaves. I know it looks like it has more, but they're all folded. There's only 2 leaves on this plant. So those welwitschia and ephedra are types of netophytes. And then we'll move into the angiosperms. I'll stop this recording and I'll do another recording to focus on the angiosperms.